We are in a housing crisis. Well, to be more specific, a cost of living crisis. It seems everything is just so expensive these days, especially the essentials we need just to live. Groceries, utilities, and of course, rent and mortgage payments. But owning a home itself has seemingly become impossible for younger generations due to property values greatly exceeding the national average wage. This isn't even new. This has actually been the case for about 30 years now. But recently, with the post-COVID price hikes, bigger chunks of our pay each week are going into other costs such as food and fuel, etc., making saving up for a home deposit far more difficult. Most of the working class population is essentially trapped into renting, and people are rightfully getting quite angry about this. And when people are angry, they want action and results now. To simplify, housing prices are the way they are because wealthy investors are enabled and encouraged to maximize the value on their properties via government policies and tax incentives. To break it down quite simply, to invest into property is to purchase property, make efforts to increase its value, i.e. its price, with the intent to make more money than you initially spent on it in the first place. And when the value of a property increases, so too do the values of the properties around it, and so on. And then it gets to a point where properties reach such a value that generally only wealthy people can buy in anymore. I will go into more detail later, but that's just a very basic rundown. However, there seems to be a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding surrounding housing prices. Economic issues tend to be quite complicated, but angry people don't want to learn about complex systems. They want quick, easy explanations they can point the finger at and blame. And often the case, they like to point the finger at and blame immigrants.
Immigrants, I knew it was them. Even when it was the Bears, I knew it was them.
Because what is more Australian, more patriotic than to hate on foreigners? This sentiment is echoed in Friendly Geordie's video, Why House Prices Won't Go Down, where he partially blames immigrants amongst other factors.
There are too many Asians. One's too many. But migration is... it's just this. It's a wedge. And what we're going to do today is try and collect all the wedges. And
he even then goes on to promote the Labor Party for wanting to cut immigration rates and then chastise the Liberals and the Greens for blocking it.
Labor's the only party that's proposing to meaningfully cut migration. Dutton pretended and then voted with the Greens to block Labor's migration cuts.
And just before anyone thinks I actually support the LNP, the Labor Party is absolutely the lesser of two evils, and Peter Dutton losing his seat was one of the best possible outcomes we could have asked for. But let's get back on topic. No, the effect immigration has on our housing crisis is so minute, so minuscule that it may as well be non-existent. And I will thoroughly be explaining how later on. This is important to clear up because by spotlighting foreigners as a problem, this creates a us versus them mindset which perpetuates xenophobia and racism and fuels racial conflicts and violence, while also distracting us from the real causes that we should be rallying and fighting against. Now, currently, as I'm recording this, there is talk to introduce new hate speech laws and bring in harsher punishments for our current hate speech laws. And while this sounds like a good thing, this in reality will most likely just be used to put an end to the Gaza protests that our governments have been trying and failing to put an end to thus far, using the same old tactic of hiding behind anti-Semitism. Hey guys, before I get into the video, I just wanted to quickly say I've been really enjoying making these videos, and it seems people have too. While certainly more people have been sitting through these than I initially thought there would be, I would still like to broaden my audience somewhat. So maybe if you like this video or if you learned something, maybe consider subscribing, or better yet, you could leave a comment, as I'm still like really new to this. I don't quite know what is and isn't working for people. So if you could like leave some feedback, that would be amazing. And just like all my videos, all the links to my research can be found in a Google Doc in the description, which I highly encourage people to actually check out and read rather than just let people on YouTube tell them things. But just a heads up, there is a lot there. Economics is quite complex. Who knew? Also, most of the writing and research for this video was done by November 2025, meaning I had no data for the last financial quarter, but that shouldn't really make a big difference in the grand scheme of things. Anyways, sorry for this little interruption, and let's get on with the video. In August 2025, Australians from all over the country banded together and marched as a united front to bring awareness to and hopefully end such an anthropogenic disaster that is unjustly the cause of such supposed destruction and suffering to such a large proportion of people, not seen at this magnitude in Australia anyways, since the British invasion of 1788. And no, I'm not talking about the genocide in Gaza, but obviously the immigration crisis. Yep, on August 31st, 2025, an estimated of 50,000 plus nationalists, neo-Nazis, and people who will say things like, "I'm not racist," but all marched side by side, hand in hand, in cities all across the country to protest the concerningly high immigration numbers. And just listening to the people in the anti-immigration rallies for a second, and you'll see that they do have some real concerns of immigrants coming into the country. Real to them, I should clarify, not real to reality.
Put a ring on a young lady's finger and give her security and a family, marry her and have kids, if you can't put a roof over your bloody head. We can't build enough homes to house the people in the country.
They believe it is the immigrants who are responsible for the preposterous housing price increase in recent years. The logic is that as immigration populations increase, so too does the need to develop more dwellings and housing, and the financial investment to do so alongside the demand for housing is what's causing the prices to skyrocket. And I'm going to completely dismantle this claim. Okay, so to assess the impact that immigration has on our housing prices, we must go look at the logic and data being spouted from those from the anti-immigration crowd. So let's start with a report done by immigration.newsaustralia.com. They make such claims such as Australia's housing market remains critically undersupplied, and that building approvals have declined by 7.2% this past year due to the rising construction costs, labour shortages, and inefficient approval processes, while pointing the finger directly at the federal government for underestimating the number of immigrants to enter Australia and thus not have enough housing to meet demands. However, with all the paragraphs and numbers they hurl at you, they only have two sources of any data or statistics. The first linking to the Australian Bureau of Statistics to show the one very specific statistic that immigration was down by about 42,000 between December 2023 and March 2024. The second source links to data from CoreLogic, which is the leading property and real estate data provider for Australia and New Zealand. This last source they provided is used to show that Sydney's median dwelling price has increased by 4.5% in 2024. That's it. That is everything they can back up or willing to back up with data from anywhere. Like, at that point, don't list your sources at all. It looks far less credible when you only provide two sources that only provide very menial statistics that only help contextualize the subject that you are discussing, but don't actually help the main point that you're trying to get across. In this case, that immigration is directly responsible for pricing increases. And since they don't provide any real data, let's pick apart what they're claiming in the report as it is. First of all, the sudden demand in housing isn't even real, or at the very least, not as impactful as people believe it is, as our number of new dwellings has actually stayed quite a bit in front of our population growth. Data shows that our dwellings have increased by 19% over the last 10 years, and that our immigration population has only increased by 16% over the last 10 years. And just to be clear, that is not a one-for-one. Immigrants make up about a third of our population today, so this would mean that a 16% immigration population growth over 10 years would only equal about 5% increase of our total population. And you also have to remember that more than one person can live in a dwelling at a time. It's not like we're taking in immigrant families and building each member of the family their own house or anything. In fact, the average across Australia is 2.5 people per dwelling. Hi, Editing Ben here. So while editing this, I went to get some more screenshots from this report, but when I paste the link into the search bar, it redirects me to this. So yeah, I guess the website was taken down or something. Oh wells, it was a shitty report anyway. But yeah, do with that information what you will. But to play devil's advocate here, it is technically true that an increase in immigrant population does indeed increase the price of housing. In 2020, right in the middle of this housing crisis, ScienceDirect.com conducted a study regarding the trends of immigration and housing. And much like the last report, they also quoted the Australian Bureau of Statistics and CoreLogic as their sources of data too. And just like a heads up, everyone is using these same statistics. Like every single person is referencing the Australian Bureau of Statistics and CoreLogic. In this report, they found that a 1% increase in a postcode's population, specifically due to immigration, only leads to an increase of 0.9% in housing prices. This means that the average immigration rate of 1.25% per annum, housing prices would have only been around 1.1% lower if there had been no immigration at all. So to calculate how much immigration would be affecting house prices, we need to know how large our immigrant population is. Due to a high volume of immigrants both entering and leaving Australia constantly, it is very hard to pin down a precise immigration population percentage. However, a study by homeaffairs.gov suggests that over the decade of 2013 to 2023, it went from 28% to 30.7%. Using this percentage, this would mean 8,278,804 people living in Australia are immigrants as of December 2023. Which sounds like a lot, yeah, until you realize that over the 10 years of 2013 to 2023, the average yearly increase of immigrants entering the country and staying here was only 0.27%. Or another way to put it, our immigration rate has only been increasing barely 0.25% each year. And using that metric earlier, that for every 1% of population growth due to immigration would only mean a 0.9% increase in housing prices, we can calculate that on average, our immigration rate should only increase housing by 2.43% over a decade. Of course, a majority of Australia's population mostly resides in our relatively few major cities. So to find the maximum amount that housing should be increasing due to immigration specifically, we will look at the region with the highest immigration rate and population, which happens to be Sydney, New South Wales. The Australian Bureau of Statistics, which I will be calling the ABS from here on out, their latest reports prior to that of the anti-immigration protests, that being the financial year 2023 and 2024, showed that the total number of migrants that entered Australia was 667,000 people. However, 207,000 of them are temporary students. And take note, it only specifies students. And we also had a total departure number of 221,000 people. It was estimated that our net population increase via immigration was 446,000 people, which was only about a 1.6% total national population increase. The state with the highest migration was New South Wales with 142,470, or just under a third of all immigrants that entered Australia that financial year. Now, there are roughly 5,600 postcodes in New South Wales to divvy up the immigrants into, but for the sake of argument and to calculate the highest possible housing price increase due to immigration specifically under these parameters, let's just assume that all 142,470 just moved to Sydney alone. Now, Sydney is also made up of several different postcodes, but to calculate the maximum price increase, let's just pretend it is one singular postcode. According to the 2021 census, which is currently the most recent, approximately 43.2% of Sydney's population were born overseas, making it the 8th largest immigrant populated city in the world. On top of that, Sydney isn't just Australia's most populated city, but in all of Oceania, with a population of 5,231,147 people, meaning Sydney's immigrant population would be about 2,259,856 in 2021. Adding another 142,470 would mean a population increase of only 6.3%, which is significantly higher than the 0.27% I stated earlier, but would still only mean a price increase of 5.67%. And remember, that price increase is only reachable if we assume that every immigrant that immigrated into New South Wales resides in Sydney within one postcode, which is silly, of course. And that would also mean that every other postcode in New South Wales would have a much lower than average price increase due to immigration as well. Now, I went over every quarterly report provided by the ABS on immigration populations, dwelling totals, as well as the mean value of dwellings available from the ABS since the first quarter 2022 to the first quarter 2025, as this were all the reports available and provided by the ABS at the point of writing this. And after compiling it all into a spreadsheet and comparing the data and making some calculations myself, I found some interesting things. Firstly, the housing price increases over those 3 years was only 6.04%. Because despite what people seem to think, under a housing crisis, there has been no singular major spike in housing costs. Another thing that I wanted to mention that I noticed while looking at the data was that the financial year of 22-23 yielded the highest increase of immigrants into Australia ever recorded by the ABS. But what is most interesting, that this was the same financial year that yielded the lowest price increase of dwellings than any other financial year at 2.4%. I'm not saying there is a direct correlation, but I'm just saying I found it very ironic that the financial year that had the highest amount of immigrants enter the country was also the same financial year that had the lowest housing price increase. Okay, so the numbers are pretty cut and dry now, right? Wrong! There are still other variables that we have yet to consider that lessen the blame on immigration further. For example, most migrants come here with temporary visas, the most common of that being visitor visas. And while uncommon, they can last up to 12 months, further increasing the immigration totals for that given year. Working and student visas are also high volume. Now, I could be wrong because I haven't asked anyone, but I imagine that when most people think of immigration rates, they are not considering that a large percentage of immigrants are only here for maybe a few years before they leave again. Most immigrants who enter Australia do go back out. A report done by homeaffairs.gov shown that in the financial year of 2023-2024, there were 210,000 permanent migrants that entered Australia that year. Contrast this with the data provided by the ABS that in the same financial year there was an immigrant population increase of 446,000, and you'll see that more than half of the immigrants that enter Australia are not permanent and therefore do not require permanent housing, and therefore free up more dwellings and houses when they leave again. And this proves that the demand for housing due to immigration isn't as high as people are making it out to be. On top of that, if we go purely off the statistics provided by the reports from the ABS from 2022 onwards, we have a total dwelling increase of 4.9% and a total population growth of both migrant and citizen of 6.3% over the same time period. But remember, the average number of people per dwelling is 2.5, meaning that statistically speaking, on average, the Australian population, both citizen and migrant, would have to grow 2.5 times the rate of our dwelling development. Using the statistics provided by the ABS, this should mean we have well over 300,000 dwellings above the current demand, with this number increasing for years to come. But also remember, a percentage of that population growth isn't here permanent either, freeing up more dwellings at most only years after the fact. Whew. I don't know about you, but after all that math and statistics and data analysis, I think I need a cold shower. So yeah, after looking at all the reports, statistics, and contextualizing the data, it is pretty clear it is not immigration that is the cause of the housing crisis. But that didn't stop 50,000 Australians from marching all across the country in an attempt to cease immigration, using housing costs as an excuse and even quoting the same immigration numbers I did to bolster their claim. So then, if it's not immigration, what's causing housing to be so unaffordable? Well, there's a whole bunch of factors to cause the prices for, well, everything to go up, including housing. To simplify, it's all about profits. When we went into a global lockdown, the world came to a standstill, basically bottlenecking supply and demand for most of the major industries of the world. As trade came to a halt, the need and demand increased drastically, causing desperation to grow. So when operations started up again, the demand was huge. This gave way to industries such as that of fossil fuels and gases to exploit the disrupted supply chains and desperate consumers by hiking up prices well beyond inflation rates. In Australia, the mining sector profited the most off of this. Their profits between 2019 and 2022 exceeded their profit margins by 69%. The mining sector made $295 billion in profits in 2022 alone. Other major industries, including wholesale trade, manufacturing, transportation, and supermarkets, also took advantage and upped their prices well higher than inflation as well. And this started a chain reaction where other businesses, companies, and corporations would then have to increase their prices and labor costs, not just to a point where they would stay afloat, but high enough so they could make a profit as well. Otherwise, what's the point, right? This is why basic necessities such as food, fuel, and power have become so much more expensive relative to the expected inflation projections. Greedy CEOs and shareholders of industries that have such a stranglehold on global trade, such as that of fossil fuel, oil, and gas companies, were able to just ramp up prices on a resource that they controlled through private ownership in a world that was intentionally designed and built to be dependent on said resource. And every other industry had to follow suit to make money themselves, because most industries also rely on fossil fuels to operate, through transportation and shipping, making everything much more expensive. This is how trickle-down economics really works, by the way. And by upping prices far beyond that of inflation, these corporations are now making record high profits, whereas wages at best are only increasing at inflation rate, and even that varies industry to industry. And I'm only talking about Australia, so I can't speak for other countries, but from what I have seen, Australia has pretty good wages compared to other Western countries like the US, for example. This means that the corporate elite are getting richer, whereas the working class, our expenses are growing faster than our wages. At the end of the day, the price for commodities is whatever the holder of those commodities wants them to be and can acquire from the consumer. I would say, and I'm sure most of you would agree, that housing is a basic necessity in order to survive. A very basic human right. But let's face facts, housing is a commodity. Currently, there is no legal right to shelter or a home, at least not here. Housing has become not much more than an investment. By moving affordability further and further out of reach for most Australians, this keeps the market much more exclusive. There are numerous tax incentives to invest in property to make money off of rather than just have a roof over your head. For example, if you own a house and you are renting it out to a tenant, you can claim the interest on your mortgage, as it counts as an associated expense to your income. You can also claim any maintenance or renovations. You can also claim depreciation on all sorts of things, ranging from appliances such as ovens and washing machines to stuff like blinds and carpets. Well, I say you can claim these things, but I really mean your landlord can claim these things on their tax, while also covering their mortgage with your rent that you spend most of your time working for. Oh, and of course there's the capital gains tax that was reduced by 50% in the late 90s, right when housing prices started to shoot up way above the average income rate. The capital gains gains tax, simply put, is a tax that you pay whenever you sell an asset for profit. This heavily incentivizes those to start selling their properties to make money, essentially driving up the value of properties everywhere. And remember, the working class was not the target consumer, but instead wealthy investors. Landlords love to deny this, but yes, you are paying off their mortgage for them. Yes, you are. There is another tax break for landlords called negative gearing, in which, should the rent payments not cover the costs of owning the investment property, they can deduct the remainder off their taxes to compensate the loss. These costs of ownership include mortgage payments, as well as maintenance and any other fees that comes with property ownership. So yeah, if your rent isn't directly covering their mortgage payment, they can just claim it off their taxes instead. So whenever you hear a landlord say something along the lines of, oh, the rent payment doesn't actually cover the mortgage payment, they are really, in a very sneaky way, just saying, remember your fucking place so you can help me keep mine. I don't know about you, but I would rather be mad at the person taking most of my wages under the guise of rent, who can also just increase said rent or decide to kick me out depending how they feel, every 6 to 12 months, while I am also paying off their investment property for them, which increases in value every single year that only they get to profit off of, despite me being the one paying for it, rather than being mad at, say, I don't know, a Nigerian student who wants to learn fine dining or whatever. It's a class divide. These tax incentives encourage and maintain the housing market to mostly cater towards wealthy investors, but require people to actually be renting these properties for these tax incentives to be a feasible selling point. And that's not likely if more average income earners are buying more houses. Okay, but what about all the wealthy foreign investors coming over here to buy up our properties, I hear you ask? That certainly does tie into the immigration housing scare. Well, once again, looking at the hard data and statistics, it shows that foreign investors aren't the ones to blame either. Okay, so I found a few different numbers here, but the most common one being cited was that out of all the dwellings owned in Australia, only 2% are owned by foreigners. ABC reported it was only 1%, and the highest number I found was 4.4%, reported by todaysconveyancer.com. And all right, let's just say for the argument it is the highest number, 4.4%. That means more than 95% of Australian dwellings are owned by Australians or Australian corporations. On top of that, not every foreign owned property is an investment property. It is fairly common for wealthy parents of an immigrant student to buy a house for their child to live in while they are over here studying. However, due to our laws, foreigners can only own property in Australia if they are taking residence in the property. Unless they become permanent citizens, the property must be sold when they leave the country again. So, to summarize, no, it isn't immigration or foreign investors that are to blame for the housing crisis. It is the wealthy elite being greedy assholes. And they will keep getting away with it if they can keep people focusing on blaming immigrants and not them. To maximize housing as a means to make money requires most of us to be unable to purchase our homes outright. And at the same time, we have to live somewhere. We really don't have a choice if we want to survive and be healthy and have privacy and have security and have somewhere to put all of our stuff. If we have to hand over 60 to 80% of our wages every week into rent, there's really not a whole lot we can do about it. I mean, we could organize a large-scale rent strike or something. Does that not sound enticing? Compared to your landlord as a renter, you have zero tax breaks, zero compensation for increase of rent rates, and zero security for your current living situation. Meanwhile, if you are unable to save up for a house deposit, then it is likely that you are also struggling with other overly inflated costs, such as utilities and food, further trapping you into renting. Like I said before, the demand for more housing isn't real. It's just part of the sales pitch used to justify the price. Buying and owning your own home was always an incentive for the working class to have something to aim for. However, it has become far more lucrative for property investors to buy up all the properties and sell them amongst each other. Nowadays, unlike just a generation or two ago, the incentive to work isn't to buy your own home, but instead to not be homeless. And you can't threaten homelessness against people who own their homes. According to eemortgagebroker.com, 66% of Australians own the homes they live in. However, only a third of those homeowners own their homes outright, meaning they aren't under a mortgage. This means about 21%, or barely just 1/5 of all Australians, just downright own their homes without the banks looming over them. Funnily enough, 21%, or just over 1/5 of homeowners own more than one property. Funny coincidence. Also, I recommend you go take a quick break. Go outside, take in some fresh air, maybe go for a walk and just look around. Go look at all the houses, all the properties, all the businesses, blocks of land. Or failing to do that, just go on YouTube and look at a drone shot of the city and try and count up all the properties. Just about every single one is owned by somebody, and only 21% of Australians downright own any property. 47%, or just under half of all homeowners, are reportedly struggling to pay off their mortgage.
Andy is one of many Australians who decided to sell their homes in the past 3 years. The number of properties changing hands within this period has surged to its highest level in at least a decade. And the number of borrowers who are at least 30 or 90 days behind on their repayments is ticking up.
During my research, I stumbled upon this blog from propertyupdate.com titled Investment Property in Australia, The Numbers Tell the Story, written by a property investor named Brett Warren, who, I don't know, sounds more like a cricket player to me. This blog tries to deflect the blame from the property investors for being the core reason why none of us can afford a fucking house. And opens up with, there's growing political and media noise around property investors being blamed for housing affordability issues. But much of this narrative doesn't hold when you examine the actual data. Facts, not opinions, reveal a more nuanced and grounded reality. I don't want to join the noise, but when the air is thick with speculation and misinformation, I like to cut through it by returning to the numbers. Because numbers don't have a political agenda. And then he proceeds to immediately shit the bed. Firstly, to be clear, whenever he is using the word investor, he's using it in place of homeowner, which, while is kind of true, is very misleading in the context of this blog. And I personally found this quite confusing until I knew that's what he meant. But it also reiterates that home ownership is a financial investment first, and a human right and means to survival second, at least to these kinds of people. He's also using the same data pools as everybody else, including myself, that of the ABS and the ATO. However, he seems to have a very strange interpretation of the data, or he's just being dishonest and underhanded. But why would a property investor want to skew the data and statistics for monetary gain? That's crazy. In his first bullet point breakdown, he comes to this conclusion. Australia has approximately 10 million dwellings. Of these, around 2.2 million dwellings are held by property investors. This means roughly 22% of Australian households own at least one investment property, while 78% do not. In other words, despite the political narrative that investors are snapping up all the homes and driving up prices, 4 out of 5 households aren't even in the game. But this means 1 out of 5 households run the game, doesn't it? Hence, housing crisis. He then shows data showing that it is generally older people who tend to have ownership, with 25% of investors aged 55 to 64, 23% are 45 to 54, 22% are 35 to 44, 13% are under 34 years of age, with the remaining unlisted 17% presumably being over 65. With his explanation for this being, this highlights that property investment is often a long-term play, with most investors entering the market later in life. This shows that most investors are mum and dad types with just a single property, but for most that enter the market later on in life, that would assume that most of them bought their properties relatively recently. But I would say it is more realistic to assume that these older investors actually purchased their properties last century, back when they were affordable, and happen to still own those properties today. Because one, there's a lot of monetary incentive to do so, and two, well, they need somewhere to live. And I should also point out that speculating about the age groups of property owners is, well, just that, speculation and not factual, whether it is coming from Brett or myself. Call me skeptical, but I'm starting to think that this Brett Warren isn't as unopinionated and objectively factual as he was hinting at the beginning. Anyways, let's keep reading. In today's dollars, investors perceive their property values as... Perceive their property values as... That sounds like an opinion. Facts, not opinions, reveal a more nuanced and grounded reality. He then goes on to immediately use these, not opinions, but perceived values as hard data. And if you actually stop to add up these percentages, 15% under 250,000, 28% between 250 to 500,000, 24% between 500,000 and 750,000, and 8% over 2 million, it only adds up to 75%. So then what are the perceived values of the other 25% of properties? Because under 250,000 and above 2 million and every other number in between kind of covers all conceivable numbers, doesn't it? Maybe Brett Warren should learn how to fucking count before trying to defend property investment. But the final point of his that I really wanted to get into is that most investors only own one property. But that doesn't change anything. As he had pointed out earlier, 4 out of 5 households aren't even in the game, and that's the issue. 4/5 of people can't acquire their own houses. The whole point of this blog was to show data to make a counter argument against blaming property investors for buying up all the properties and driving up housing prices. But what he has done here is gone and immediately lumped together single home owners alongside those who actually buy one or more additional properties with the intent to make money off of, and just goes ahead and labels them all as property investors. At no point does he ever point out the difference between a person who buys a home with the intent to live in and an actual property investor who buys and sells multiple properties to make profit. No, throughout the entire blog, he makes no separation between the two, so he can increase the total number of investors, so he can water down the averages and make such claims as, well, most investors are average income earners, and most investors only own one property, therefore they can't be buying up all the properties and driving up prices, and so on. This is just a dishonest tactic to try and shift the blame away from actual property investors. However, he slipped up pretty blatantly when he was trying to make the point that most properties aren't as valuable as people suggest. Remember that line I made fun of not too long ago? In today's dollars, investors perceive their property values as... To allow investors or property owners, which is what he means when he says investor, to allow them to perceive their value on their own properties pretty strongly tells that it is indeed up to the property owners to decide what the pricing of their properties are to be. And no, I'm not saying this one line in this one blog is hard proof of that, but Brett Warren is regarded as a successful property investor, and this is the language he uses, and that should say something at the very least. And to be clear, every property that somebody is renting is owned by someone. Every single home is owned by a property investor, as Brett calls it. There is nobody else perceiving the value and deciding your rent or purchase price of a house. And I also want you to quickly consider, what is it that a property investor does? Like, what is the point of being a property investor, I mean? The answer is to invest money into property and then make that property more valuable, therefore making it more expensive so you can make more money off of it. And if we are all to agree with Brett that every single homeowner is a property investor, does that not say that the intent of every single homeowner is to drive up prices so they can make more money? I'm generalizing, obviously. I'm just pointing out the bad logic. And as I pointed out earlier, only a third of property owners own their property outright, and half of those who are still paying off a mortgage are struggling to do so. But my point is that Brett Warren's perspective on property ownership and not being able to distinguish the difference between somebody who just wants a secure roof over their head from those who are just seeking to make money off property makes this blog defending property investors, a position which he very much benefits from, laughable at best. And while yes, all property owners do contribute to the housing prices, there are people out there that just want a secure roof over their head without landlords or real estates or banks breathing down their necks. For example, if you were offered a free house or an apartment or whatever under the condition that you could never make money off it, or hell, make money off any other property you might acquire later, would you accept it? I would wager that there is a lot of people who would. Okay, so now we know it is property investors who are driving up the housing prices, both enabled and incentivized to do so, and not immigrants. So you can stop fucking blaming immigrants for this. Also, have you not considered that since Australia has such a high immigration rate and population, and pretty much always has, definitely longer than all of us have been alive, that it is not more Australian and therefore more patriotic to encourage immigration rather than discourage it? Australia has been famously multicultural since at least the 19th century. Being multicultural is a big part of this nation's identity. And hey, most of us come from immigrant families. In fact, if you're not 100% Indigenous, then you come from an immigrant family. Even if your ancestor was the first one off the boat when the British arrived in 1788, you still come from an immigrant family. And don't say you only want immigration to cease for the sake of the economy, because it's not about that either. Basic logic should suggest that more people in an area would mean more productivity and more people spending money, thus boosting the local economy. In fact, data shows that a higher immigrant population in a region leads to larger productivity and increased wages within that region, as well as an increase of employment of Australian citizens within the same region. And I've seen comments here and there stating that immigrants get free handouts. What? No? Like, where does that idea even come from? I can't imagine this is common sentiment, but like, surely, come on. Do you really imagine that there is a hidden stash of free shelter, free food and utilities just for immigrants? So not only does immigration not negatively impact our housing costs, but is in fact a net overall positive for the economy. So how did this happen then? Why are so many people wrong about this? Many of the protesters of the anti-immigration marches would deny their motives to be that of racism, but instead patriotism. You know, the common go-to to deny racism. They are all quoting the same data sources and even some of the same numbers that I did. So what, did they all just mishear, misunderstand, or misinterpret the data? Or are they all actually just racists who are either in denial or just wish not to be perceived as racist? Well, I personally think it's a combination of the two. People's biases will always get in the way when interpreting data and analysis, despite what the objective facts and logic people believe. 446,000 immigrants entering Australia last year alone sounds like a lot. But when comparing and contextualizing the data, it really isn't. Over 2.2 million immigrants live in just Sydney alone. And that sounds like a lot. And yeah, maybe to an extent it is. But Sydney has always had an extraordinarily large immigration population, and it was never a problem before, well, for most of us, but that's a core part of Sydney's identity. They just don't like it. But the truth is we are going through a cost of living crisis, and housing has just become so grossly unaffordable. And yes, this pisses me off too. We are all angry about this. In fact, I would say that being angry that we are being denied a secure shelter, a very basic human right, because we aren't inherently better off than 2/3 of the population, is a very reasonable reason to be pissed off. But if you are inclined to believe it is because of immigration without question or confirmation, then that says a lot about you, doesn't it? Confirmation bias is a thing, and not only will we seek out information that confirms our beliefs, but we also interpret the data based off our biases as well. Because like it or not, we are all bias. The people who will claim they are not biased are just trying to assert their views and opinions as definitive using cherry-picked statistics and to gain an intellectual authority of sorts. But these people also tend to be the most closed-minded out of anyone involved in the conversation. And sure, if you want to turn this around on me and say that my biases caused me to misinterpret the data and get things wrong, sure, go for it. Go and actually read all the reports and datas that I'm providing in the Google Doc and point out what I got wrong. I'm certainly not saying that I'm incapable of making mistakes or getting things wrong. Quite the opposite. I'm saying fact check people before blindly believing them and be thorough on your research. Or otherwise just acknowledge you might not know what you're talking about. For example, on August 13, nearly 2 weeks prior to the anti-immigration march, Ben Fordham, host of the 2GB radio show and someone I sadly have to share a name with, proclaimed that 1,544 immigrants entered Australia every single day. And in his words, would add up to 457,000 immigrants in the financial year of 24-25.
Every single day, Australia is now taking in 1,544 new people. If we zoom out and have a look at the full 2024-2025 financial year, we've had 457,000 arrivals. 457.
Which is why he believed the anti-immigration marches were being organised at all. Of course, this is just wrong. Firstly, there are no current reports for the 24-25 immigration numbers as of the writing of this video, let alone when he said it. So any speculation of those figures are just that, speculation. Secondly, if he just made an honest mistake and actually meant the financial year prior, that of 23-24, then his numbers are still off by 11,000. As you might recall, the immigration number that came in according to the ABS was 446,000. In fact, the Australian Bureau of Statistics held a press release denouncing the accuracy of his claim, and fact-checking websites such as aap.com.au also could not find a single source to Ben's number. They did, however, find contradictory data that proclaims that the daily average was only 931 arrivals daily, or only about 60% of his claim. This could mean Ben is misinformed or misremembering the data, which kind of makes it sound like he doesn't know what he's talking about, regardless whether he's just speculating or if he just made a mistake and got some of the details wrong. Like in this case, the year and the numbers. Oh, and to really nail down my point that he has no idea what he's talking about, he said that 1,544 immigrants arriving every day adds up to 457,000, which is also just wrong, and that is hilarious to me. 1,544 every day for a year equals 565,104 if you take into account 2024 being a leap year, a number which you might notice is significantly different to what Ben Dickhead Fordham said. So yeah, if you want to march in the streets to try and cease immigration. Stop hiding behind housing. Stop hiding behind the economy. Stop hiding behind cherry-picked examples of racial violence. Just own your intentions and just own your racism. Immigration is a big part of the Australian cultural landscape, and if you don't agree, well, hey, how un-Australian of you. How unpatriotic of you. How can you call yourself a patriot if you're only accepting of 2/3 of Australia's society at large? Immigration, whether you like it or not, is part of our identity. And if you don't like it, actually, no. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and borrow a line I hear so often from the right. If you don't like it, fuck off to another country then. I love the use of that argument in this context because the irony of migrating to another country because you hate immigration, could you imagine? Look, if your goals align with that of neo-Nazis and you'll peacefully walk together side by side, waving the Australian flag together, then yeah, maybe you should take a long hard think in the shower if it really all just does come down to skin coloration. And don't think I was just glossing over that neo-Nazi part. Within these rallies marched the Australian neo-Nazi group known as the National Socialist Network.
When I say Aussie, you say pride! Aussie! Pride! Aussie! Pride! Aussie, Aussie, Aussie!
Not to be confused with the actual Socialist Party or ideology. And since I have seen in many a Facebook comments section that Nazis were socialists, I'm just going to quickly explain this. Nazi ideology, which is what the National Socialist Network, or NSN, follows, is defined by nationalism, white supremacy, promoting totalitarianism, and suppression or outright removal of political opponents or races it deems lesser than themselves, the superior whites. They believe this means they have the inherent right to rule over or control or eradicate those beneath them, meaning foreigners or those of different races or religions or those with differing political views. They are about as far to the right of the political spectrum as you can get. They generally stand against democracy and Marxism. Socialism, on the other hand, is and has always been defined mostly by the public owning the means of production and also limiting or downright removing the differences in class, race, or gender. The idea that people are more equal to one another and should be treated as such. This extends to healthcare, wages, and housing. These two ideologies are so far removed from each other in like every aspect. Oh, but the National Socialist Network has socialist in the title. Yeah, no, you guys need to learn things before forming opinions, not after. But look, it's okay. I understand. You're not really racist, but you will blame immigrants for housing costs they did not cause and will go as far as to march in the streets in an attempt to get our government to prevent immigration into Australia. You're not racist, but you will believe that immigrants are the core cause of such issues, such as affordable housing, on a whim without question or fact checking. Or at the very least, you won't read past the first paragraph in any study or statistical report. You're not racist, but you will march alongside blatant racists and members of Nazi and white supremacy orientated organizations. You're not racist, but you want to help maintain a predominantly white population within a nation literally stolen from the very non-white Aboriginal people proclaiming it's not about race, it's about the economy. The economy for a nation that you would prefer to be predominantly white. Fuck off.